Well, friends, thank you for joining us for another conversation about what is worship. Today I am joined by Eoghan Heaslip, all the way in Dublin. Welcome, Eoghan. We're
Thank you.
so glad that you're joining us. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about yourself and also your links to the vineyard for those people that don't know who you are.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, yeah. So my name is Owen. I am the lead pastor of a church in Dublin called St. Catherine's. It used to be called Core, so it's had a bit of a name change in the last decade. So maybe some people might have heard of Core, but maybe not of St. Catherine's. Um, Married to the best part of my life, I suppose, is that I'm married to Becky. We've been married for nearly 25 years now. We have three grown-up kids, or well, it feels like they're grown up. 20, nearly 22, 20, 19, and 15. So we're in a very different life stage, and with school and university and all that kind of stuff. And we had been living in England until almost 7 summers ago. We moved back to Dublin to plant a church, which was basically kind of based around a model of hospitality, doing life and community together around dining room tables, as opposed to in a kind of a building like the one we've inherited with St. Catherine's, which is 250 years old. And then we got the opportunity to join the staff team of St. Catherine's again, having planted that church. We took the whole church plant with us and kind of sowed it into the life of St. Catherine's, which has been an exciting journey. But yeah, I actually became a Christian on one of the first Alpha courses St. Catherine's ever did.
Oh,
So
wow.
a lot of the time when you talk to somebody who grew up in the life of the church, and maybe goes on to ministry in one way or another, they don't always stay around, do they? They often end up going off to do something else. So we're very excited to be but it's very much about coming home for me. Yes, we were living in England, so it's coming back and home to Dublin, but actually to be in Dublin and to be working on the staff team of St. Catherine's, where I became a Christian. It was where I led worship for the first time.
Wow.
I led a song I'd written for the first time, and an amazing journey, kind of like a full circle for us, of going away on sabbatical, thinking we would never even come back to Ireland, to being back in Dublin, back in the church that I became a Christian in as the lead pastor. It's been an incredible journey,
That's
and
fantastic.
yeah, we're very very grateful to God for that. So there's been lots of transition in our lives. I don't know if you know anything about the way that the Church of Ireland or the Church of England, the Anglican structure works, but you kind of go forward thinking, oh, I sense that God's got a call in my life to leadership, might be ordained, might not be, and then you go, you kind of get your vetted and your I's dotted and your T's crossed, and then you go to theological college, you do that for 3 to 4 years, then you go to do a curacy for another 3 to 4 years, depending on your context, and then you're kind of spat out at the end of this kind of 8 year process to lead a church yourselves, and you're moving countries, moving schools. So it kind of, and then when you're pioneering something, you're planting something from scratch, and it's just been a very well, it's been a time where we've just had a huge amount of change. So it kind of feels nice to be in a period of just, we know where we are, we know that we're in the right thing for where God's got us. And now the other part of your question, which was being tied to the vineyard, I suppose, my first experience of the vineyard was the very, very first. It's a very important memory for me because it was the first time I was in my pajamas outside. So there is a huge basketball arena in a university, literally just 5 minutes down the road here.
Right.
And it was at the beginning of the 80s, and I was being babysat by family friends, while
Uh-huh.
my parents went to a conference that John Wimber was doing.
Okay.
And not my parents didn't know, I don't think they knew what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
And so it went way, way longer than they were thinking, because with all the prayer ministry and the response and the worship, that the people babysitting me ran out of time. So they had to drive me fully robed in my snuggy costume. And I remember being led in from the car park, through the main doors of this arena, entrance. And when you're out walking in the cold in the winter and you go into Boots or something like that, and they have one of those down heaters,
Uh-huh.
the blow heaters that
Uh-huh.
kind of
Uh-huh.
stop all the hot air going out and all the cold air coming in. Yeah, I remember going into that room, and it was like I was just like in a completely different place, and it was my first memory of the tangible presence of God. It was
Wow.
like outside, I was in my pajamas, worried about who was going to see me, and then I was in this space, and obviously it was just like God was moving incredibly powerfully, and this person that was babysitting me led us up to, I think they were afraid, not sure they knew what was happening, led us up the top of these kind of, tiered seats, and we sat there, and it was just this, you could just sense the presence of God coming, wave after wave and wave after these people, and you would hear laughter and tears and pain. And on the stage there was an elderly guy who was part of the Anaheim Vineyard team, who um was just strumming on this brown acoustic guitar. I couldn't tell you anything else about it,
Mm.
but it was the first time I could remember being in a corporate sense of sung worship happening while the ministry of the Holy Spirit was going on. And that had a hugely profound impact on me. Even every time I speak about it, I get emotional,
Mm.
because it was at that conference that a member of the Anaheim team walked all the way across to where my dad was, and God had told this woman his name,
Wow.
said, "Are you Jack Heaslip?"
Oh, wow.
And he said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "You're to take the job in Westport." And then
Wow.
she just walked away. Now, she couldn't have known this. Like, she was on the team from Anaheim, like I said, but it was, Dad had just been approached by, my dad was also an Anglican priest, and
Mm-hmm.
he'd literally just that week before been approached by the people picking the next pastor in their parish.
That's amazing.
And based on that night, we left Dublin, moved to the west of Ireland, and they had a really rich ministry there before they moved to Cork. But yeah, so my experience at the Vineyard was like, has changed my life, and and then I suppose the one of the better, well, one of the hugely significant things with my wife grew up in the Vineyard. We met in Canada at a worship training school. And yeah, one of my best friends is a guy called David Roos, who I
Mm-hmm.
also met at the same ministry school. So it's been where what I've ended up doing doesn't certainly currently fit inside of what the Vineyard is doing in Dublin, but it's like, it's always been there in the background since I was a child, um, with the way it modelled particularly worship and ministry in the Holy Spirit, and I suppose through the lens of David and Anita's ministry, working with the urban poor and issues of social justice, and yeah, and church planting, just being creative and going with what we sense we're meant to do. So yeah, like
Amazing. I mean, I didn't know where
yeah,
you were
mate.
going to go with the story about the pajamas. That was a good
Yeah,
one. That's
Well, you never know when you're wearing your pajamas outside. You then never know what's going to happen. That's the moral of the story.
oh, that's such a good story. I love that so much. And we are extremely fond of David and Anita, and they've had a massive impact on worship, I would say, across the vineyard and
Yeah,
beyond, as what you're saying. But it's really wonderful to hear some of those stories. And I would have been listening to some of your music, and certainly the album that you did with David Ruiz
mm.
from Powers Court, which I don't even know if you can even get that anywhere. I'm reluctant to mention it because the last time I mentioned it, somebody went to try and find it and couldn't even get it. So,
Yeah. It's a bizarre thing. I have mixed feelings about that record. It was like uh, when it's good for your humility when you get more encouragement and feedback from something that you didn't really know how to do what you were trying to do, and it was the first thing that you ever did. But that has like disproportionately, so we've had all these crazy stories about friends driving through Mozambique and they turn on the radio in the car, and Paris Court 2000 came on some random Christian
mm,
radio, and yeah, I suppose it was a really interesting conference. I think one of the things that maybe isn't as obvious on the record, aside from the pitchy vocals and the unfinished songs maybe, but um, it was, I suppose, that it was a very special gathering in that it was churches from across the city. And I think from the beginning of our time together, it was just a weekend conference. It was recorded by Catherine Scott's dad, who had his gear set up in a little trailer at the back of this tent. It was lashing rain the entire weekend. We had never done anything like that in our whole lives. And yeah, when we gathered, it was just like, wow, it was just such a special thing. I think when Christians come together like that, yeah, God always just honors it. I think
mm,
something
wow.
about worship and unity that I think is quite powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I listened to it so much I wore it out. I
Yeah.
mean, it was on repeat. Um, it was pretty powerful. So you have been involved in worship over the years. I don't know if I've told you. I also went to you did a live recording in Dublin,
Mm,
and I think it was early in my days of arriving on this island. And somebody invited me to come. And because I had listened to that other album, I was like, oh,
right.
brilliant. I'll come along to that. So yeah, I was there that night as well. Um,
Well, we did. We ended up doing two live albums. So we did one in 2002, and then we did another one. It was probably about 3 years later. Yeah, end of '04, beginning of '05, and that was at the time I was signed to a label called Hosanna Integrity. They've since changed their name now. I think it's Integrity Europe or whatever.
mhm.
And Brian Dirksen was also on the first record, and so that's 2002 ish. Brian Dirksen was also recording his record in the same in our church, the same venue,
Mhm.
which was called You Shine. I don't know if you ever heard
Mhm.
that. I loved that record,
Mhm.
and so yeah, so that was another great night, and it was based on the songs on. Not all of them, but some of the songs that we recorded on Paris Course,
Mhm.
I suppose that just seemed to translate, and yeah, we found ourselves doing that as well. So yeah,
Yeah,
fascinating journey. Yeah,
that's great. That the song, I think it's called True Intimacy.
yeah,
I mean, that one feels so vineyard to me. It's like
Oh, that's a huge compliment. I'll take that.
Speaking our language in that one, it's just powerful. Um, so you are in Dublin, I'm in Belfast. At present, I can't, we couldn't actually see each other in real life.
No, we had made plans a number of months ago, but
Yeah.
it all got shelved, didn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to revisit that at some point. But um, I'm really excited to speak to someone who is in the Republic of Ireland. Our
Mm,
presence as a vineyard in the Republic of Ireland is, small in one sense, but potent because of the people, because they're amazing
yeah.
people. Um, and I'm excited to hear an Irish perspective on some things here because a lot of people listening to this will be in the UK, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm also excited because you are another person who's gone from worship leader to the dark side of pastor, minister. So
That's it.
we'll dive into the question. I suppose the question that um, has triggered these conversations is everyone is wondering in the midst of this pandemic, what is worship? Can we sing? Can we not sing? If we don't sing, is it still worship? And all these questions. And in the vineyard, if do we have a liturgy? What is our liturgy?
Yeah.
um and so I would love to know from someone who is a worship leader but also a church leader, what would you say that worship is?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this a little bit before we started, or pressed record. I definitely feel like it's an important question, but I think it's important to be honest and at the start and to say that I think it's something I've wrestled with and grappled with. I think 20 years ago I probably had a shiny one-liner, and there would have been some important words in there, and I think at that time it was a lot of the way that we were talking in church life was very much about kind of words like whether it was encounter or intimacy or and I'd read lots of Dallas Willard and read lots of different authors, and some of the people we've already mentioned, and Matt Redman and others, and I suppose and Graham Kendrick too, shaped a lot of my thinking about what worship was, what the word worship, the English word, and so on. But I think, and this is something I've had to learn over the years, that there's quite articulating something is one thing, giving expression to something faithfully. It does feel like it's something else. The two are connected, of course. Language isn't so important, but it's like the books behind me here. Having them on my shelf doesn't mean I've read them. Having read them doesn't mean I've lived them, or whatever. So it's for me, the what is worship question is something that's very much been evolving and emerging over the past 25 years or so. And I think maybe 20 plus years ago, it would have been very me centered. I don't necessarily mean me focused, but very much about the musician who had been employed to, it's one of the pitfalls of being a professional Christian. It's your job, and actually, if you don't do your job well, or, if you don't raise people up, and so that you're not exhausted, there's other people and they lead with the same, not like a carbon copy of you. There's administration, there's feedback to team members and to other leaders, there's the resources and getting the right songs, and I think that created, I mean, there was this love and this sense of call to lead worship, but there was this growing anxiety, I think, as to whether or not I was any good, or I probably compared myself quite a bit. So For a time, I think when I thought about what worship was, I thought about work. I thought about, was I doing it right? You know, where were the areas where I needed to grow? And I think eventually, at times, so I kind of fell in and out of love with it. I think there was times where I was just like, gosh, is this working? Have I kind of lost the simplicity of, like, that picture that I talked about earlier on, being in that early vineyard gathering in the 80s here in Dublin in UCD basketball arena, the simplicity of someone just sitting there with a single acoustic guitar, unaccompanied, pouring out their heart and their life, and these through the lens of particular songs with specific language and vocabulary about intimacy and love and loving Jesus. And you know, I realized I probably forfeited some of that because I was so obsessed with this growing. And that's the thing. Everyone says, "Oh, I'd love to write a song," or "I'd love to get a song published," or a song to be on a record. Or it was back in the day. It was like, to have a song in a songbook, that was printed at a conference in the summer. And there was all these kind of like goals, and and I think it's like the when someone working for a pastor and say, oh, they hear of something that's great that's working in another context, a course, whether it's alpha or something else, and without really giving it any thought, you just because it's working and you long to see fruit where you are, you just copy it without really giving thought. And I think that approach to ministry and to worship probably impacted the worship in our church in quite a big way. So it wasn't just about whether or not I was being myself before God and the people that I loved. It was actually, you were actually trying to do a particular style that was preferred by people and maybe by the leadership of a church or other. I mean, that's not the only church I've been on the staff of. So there's that sense of, for worship to be good, what needs to have happened? That one of those kind of vision pieces. If you don't share that with the person that's your line manager or your boss, or it can become quite complicated. So all of that to say, I feel like I had this narrowing picture of what worship was, and it wasn't until probably about 8 or 9 years ago that I really did just like literally, it's one of my favorite memes or gifs, where Homer Simpson, sinks backwards through the hedge and disappears. And I kind of hung up my guitar, and
Wow.
I thought, I'm done with this. I'm done with my experience of the music industry. I'm done with. I just kind of need to dream this all up again. I need to go to God. I need to get back the simplicity piece, and I think that's been the journey I've been on. Realizing actually worship it does involve me, and it does involve skill. It does involve, I mean, that was another word that crept in the 20 years ago, the whole, what it means to be the excellence. There was always a seminar on excellence at worship conferences. Now that I reflect on it, they never asked me to do those kinds of conferences. Maybe, yeah, those seminars. Maybe there's a reason for that.
That's
Um,
hilarious.
so I think there's that narrowing and that kind of forfeiting of the very, special thing that I suppose that got me into worship in the first place, that I just kind of lost sight of, maybe lost perspective along the way, and I needed to kind of dig that out again with God together, and to play your guitar and to sing before Him, kind of putting your hope and trust in Him when you're not preparing for a worship set, when you're not trying to write a song, and yeah, and I suppose just starting to enjoy it again. it had stopped being enjoyable. It had stopped. And as you know, the things I'm thinking about so much of what God's speaking to me about in terms of what worship is at the moment. I think mutuality is a big part of that. This is, if like theologians often call Luke 15, the prodigal son, like the gospel within the gospels. This the father who's scanning the horizon, waiting for us to come home, to turn to him. Or that language, when he's feeding the food of the pig, he's eating the food that the pigs were being given. And it talks about, the New Living Translation talks about him coming to his senses. There's that, like, oh, I don't have to live like this. I can go back to the Father. And worship is that mutuality. So it's not just something I'm doing. I'm not it's not just me in that sense, whether it's at home or whatever, or when we're together as a family, a community of faith. Um, but he's there waiting, and I think that's been something I needed to kind of rekindle. Psalm, I was writing it down earlier so I wouldn't forget it. Psalm 32 verse 7 talks about being surrounded by God's singing of songs of victory over us. That's quite, it kind of resonates with that Zephaniah, isn't it? Zephaniah again, chapter 3. And even just how, even in the New Testament, there's that further on in the New Testament when Paul is writing about the Spirit enabling us to cry, Abba, that there's, even there, God is enabling that response. Even there, he's initiating it and drawing it out of us. And homecoming may be kind of moments. It may be like the one I talked about earlier on when I was a child. But I think what I'm learning is that homecoming is like that. Eugene Peterson phrase, which is better known for the way it ends than the way it starts. He talks about not flailing around on the dead horse of experience, but ours is a pedestrian way. It's about putting one foot in front of the other, and then he goes on to say a long obedience in the same direction, which is not his. They're not his words, but he uses them there, and that tends to be what everyone kind of quotes. But yeah, it's realizing actually. And we were praying that last night, even and in a prayer ministry time on Zoom, where Psalm 23 speaks about the goodness of God pursuing us all the days of our lives. So anyway, so this, I suppose I was just trying to give you some examples there of how what worship for me is. Yes, it involves doing what we're doing, and maybe it's not sung worship, maybe it's liturgical or it's contemplative or it's about doing, the examen or whatever the discipline, whatever the means, whatever the vehicle rather. But it's recognizing actually that he's there scanning the horizon, waiting for me to come home, as opposed to it's a job I'm doing. And I even think, and I suppose try to engage with our worship leaders about this, even as myself, as I've started to lead worship again more over the last year than I have in the last 10 maybe. But it's trying to lead from that place too. That there's no pressure to deliver, to really knock it out of the park. And that's the. I mean, I talked earlier on about a church that we planted, and one of our friends, we just met her at the school gate. She, Marion, she's ended up following Jesus, and uh, she's very, very much involved in the leadership of the church plant we were doing, and now St. Catherine's. But I can remember the first time she came for dinner, and there was about 25 of us in the room. So this isn't some huge big worship space, kind of amazing band and all that kind of stuff. It was literally just me and my baby Taylor at the end of the table, and me on it. I make a baby Taylor look like a ukulele. I'm on the bigger side, And the end of a prayer time, and I just did I lose you there?
I think we're back. You're back at you're at the table.
Yeah, so Marion, this friend, um, the first time she came for dinner, we did our dinner, and I think she was still waiting to see like what part of this was going to be anything to do with faith or to do with
Mm.
spirituality, which is what we'd said we were exploring as a community. And we just had hospitality and food, and we were asking each other high points and low points of our day. And then I took my guitar out and I sang, Jesus, Holy and Anointed One. So this is like 1989, okay? It doesn't matter where the song comes from, I think, particularly when it's well written.
Yeah.
And we sang at the end, Jesus, I love you, Jesus, I love you, like every Vineyard worship leader has, for however many years on
Mhm.
that song. It's just so incredibly helpful, and put the guitar down. And she didn't really kind of understand I suppose, what the protocol was. You didn't, that in a time of stillness, you don't just kind of, she hadn't learned the, you know, hands out, kind of just waiting. As
Yeah.
soon as I put the guitar down, everyone else was kind of just still, and she just goes, "What was that?"
Oh, wow.
And the tears streaming down her face, and it had nothing to do with the song, and it certainly didn't have anything to do with me, how I sang it. But I just said, well, that's the presence of God. And she's like, I want more of that.
Mm.
And so I was able to, I mean, I wasn't planning on it, but we were able to then, in that moment, teach into who the Spirit was, that the Spirit was God, um, eternally, equally God, like Jesus was, which was also news to her at the time. She didn't know Jesus was God either. But it's nights like that where you realize, actually, it's not. It it does. Yes, of course, it matters that we do things well. Yes, of course, there's going to be songs that work better in our context, or spiritual disciplines and practices that seem to translate into our communities. And that will change, won't it, over the years and over the seasons and so on. But on that night, it was just a song from 1989 written by a couple, the Barnetts, and yeah, it was just. But that was the most refreshing thing anyone had asked me in probably years and years and years. What was that?
What was that?
Because she could feel, she could sense God's presence as we as a community turned our hearts towards Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And the net result was, and we know that because the scriptures tell us that when two or three are gathered, I'm there. And the way Jesus is with us is through the power of the Spirit. And of course, he was showing her that night, and all of these things, I suppose, they kind of collide and they come together and they inform what we think worship is. And I just realized it was communal that night. It was mutual that night. Yes, it mattered that we sang because I think it helped us. It helped to put some kind of structure on our time together. But it was really just the thing that night, just pointing to the real thing, which is that Marion was starting to come home for the first time. Um, and that nothing compares to that stuff. I just love it.
That is amazing. And it seems to me that one of the things is I'm imagining myself into that story, right? And I'm at the table with you. And I think the fact that you were sitting there with her where she could see you,
Mm,
she could talk to you, where she could voice her reaction and you could engage together. You
yeah,
weren't on a platform. The
yeah,
lights weren't dimmed. There was no
big.
smoke machine, and I know that probably some of our crew are tired about me talking about production. I do value good production, but these kinds of stories don't happen in the same way. I mean, I don't think that it's not that people don't encounter Jesus in a big gathering. They absolutely do, and certainly I have as well. But there's something about that. that woman who doesn't know Jesus yet being able to then ask a question of you and talk to you about it, which is so profound, instead of just being, exiting the building at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Um,
So it does say something about expressions of community as well,
mm,
I think. So you have, you're trying to grow the church small. So there's I mean a lot, and I mean small groups. The very place the first place I ever heard of that was in a Vineyard small group leaders training conference. So the Vineyard, you invented small groups. No, I'm joking.
I don't think
Um,
I
but
did.
it there is something about worship in different spaces that call and enable and release different outcomes, don't they?
Hmm.
But I think what you're getting at there, in terms of the production piece, if we are gathered, sorry, I'm going to turn my email off so it doesn't keep doing that. I thought I'd done that.
That's okay.
Um, yeah, I think when it comes to the excellent stuff that you mentioned a minute ago, I think that stuff really, really does um, have an impact. On. And I wonder, I don't know, this is just an idea, if actually if you think about the emergence and you know, the impact of ministries like Maverick City, House Fires, actually one of the things that they've been doing is they've been bringing the front to the center.
Mm,
And I think that's just something God's been doing, I think.
good.
So I'm with you 100% on that.
Mm,
That sense of the professional is at the front, it kind of creates this band of kind of seats in the church where you can kind of come and essentially be anonymous. And there's times where I've needed to go to a church and to be anonymous and just to be there for a season. But
mm,
inevitably, what you want is for people to begin to participate and to come into the life of the church family and feel that they can contribute and belong. But maybe that's another conversation.
Well, it just strikes me that in the Vineyard we talk about everyone gets to play,
Oh yeah,
the priesthood of all believers. And I think coming out of the pandemic, the other thing that struck me about your story is that it feels very relevant to the moment that we're living in right now. Because I can imagine having a barbecue in my back garden, only
yeah,
just maybe. It'll soon be legal, I think. Um, and, I can imagine that space, inviting some people into that space more than I can imagine a big group. So I think there is something about what you're saying that is really relevant to the moment that we're in. That as a story that I think speaks to an opportunity that we have right now.
yeah,
And in the Vineyard, we talk about the priesthood of all believers and everyone gets to play. And so I think this is a significant moment for us. I
yeah,
think, and it is for the church worldwide, but since I'm speaking mainly to Vineyard worship leaders, I guess I think it was inspired that you shared that story today. I really feel I really relate to it, like I was there with you, um, and I met Jesus in a really powerful way for the first time in a Vineyard small group as well, through worship. And
yeah,
I came unglued. I had
yeah,
tears streaming out of my face. I thought I was having a mental breakdown. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before. I'd never felt Jesus come so close. And I had a friend there with me, and I was able to say to her, "Girl, that was weird. What
yeah,
was that? What's happening to me?" And so I think that these moments to journey with people, as you're saying, with others, the communal aspect of this, I just think that people are going to be
yeah,
hungry for that. They're going to be ready to
yeah.
truly be with another person in this.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's trying to set what you've just said alongside of, I mean, it always seems a little dangerous to quote John Wimber to a vineyard pastor, but I'm going to
Go
do it
for
anyway.
it. Go
But
for it.
obviously there's loads of different sound bites over the years which I've valued of his, but when he talks about, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. I think that our approach to worship, kind of keeping that fluid, keeping that, you know, I suppose if you make those observations about communal and mutual and that sense of actually that God is there waiting for us, I suppose you need to try and keep on breaking that down into practical, tangible steps. Okay, so how do we ensure that we don't just run on past these things? How do we make sure that we make space for that to happen? We choose songs that enable that, that language of homecoming and all those kinds of things. I mean, it reminds me of the. I'll just tell one more story if that's okay.
Absolutely.
But when I was doing my curacy, so training, the after college, you go and it's where you do your first wedding and your first funeral and your first everything, and one of the kind of elders in the church was we got on in a big way, and we had nothing in common, but we just had this really cheeky one-upmanship relationship, and we were always trying to catch each other out. So I was wrapping up a meeting at the front, as we were talking about, on a Sunday, had the handheld mic in my hand, and he is walking. I could see him. He's walking up the middle of the church, and he's got these two Asian women with him, and he looked at me and said they wanted to speak to a priest and get a priestly blessing, and then he winked at me and then left. So I'm there standing with these two ladies. They don't really have excellent English, but they kept on. They were compelled to come in off the street. They were walking past our church, and they kept on touching their chest here. And one of them, they were talking to each other, and eventually tumbled out that what they were trying to describe was they could feel the energy coming out the front doors down onto the high street.
Fantastic.
And they were trying to, and we had just been worshipping as we closed. And, they had, I can't remember where they'd grown up, but there was obviously some kind of Catholic missionary school of some kind that they had attended, so they understood. So they bowed their heads and kind of cupped their hands and waited for me to pray for them. And I said, well, listen, if I'm going to pray for you, I'm going to pray a blessing in Jesus' name. Are you okay with that? So I prayed for them, and I didn't. It wasn't one of those conversion moments. It wasn't one of those things where. But I can remember being in the car on the way home after church, and I was just at the traffic lights waiting, just asking, what was it? What happened there? That these two people would be in that space, they would hear what they heard, and they were talking about it in terms of energy. They could feel the presence of God.
Fantastic.
And it was just one of those times where God was just gracious enough just to help me to hear him. And it was just that it was the sound of homecoming. That was where that idea of that people turning back, that aha moment, that coming to our senses on a Sunday together as family, that there's something in that. There's just the joy of God as we come home, as opposed to how passionate and convincing we sound. So it's both. It's both.
So good. I think there's another homecoming thing that I'm sensing, another homecoming theme in what you said earlier. You were talking about your own experience as a worship leader and
Yeah,
sort of falling out of love with worship.
yeah,
And I feel like I've had lots of conversations with worship leaders who are either exhausted, whether that's due to the pressures of pandemic and online live streaming Zoom worship. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
it's been a steep learning curve for all of us, or just in general, maybe the production and the relentlessness of Sundays even before the pandemic hit. Or for some of the worship leaders I'm talking to, it's actually about an age and a stage thing where they've been leading for a number of years and maybe feel like age 35 is the end of the road as a worship leader. But I wonder if
Uh-oh.
you could just speak into that. Yeah, well, I'm older than 35 and I still lead worship, but um, I wonder if you could just speak into that. For it just struck me as you were talking, there might be some people listening that really resonate with that. I don't actually love this anymore. I don't like this is
Yeah.
not enjoyable. So what do I do now that it's not enjoyable?
I mean, I suppose it depends on your context. I think I probably, I think I was a little bit embarrassed that I was burned out because it was almost like it had snuck up on me.
Mm,
And I think, I mean, it's often one of those kind of questions, isn't it? What would your 45-year-old self say to your 25-year-old self? Um, I think I would answer that question, and maybe it's through that lens that I might say something about the question you've asked. But I would say I wish I'd had a spiritual director,
mm,
um, someone that is their response. They don't need to be your friend,
right.
and their only interest in you is to help you um, uh, be a son or a daughter
Mm,
of God. That's really just that's really what their connection to you is. And um, I think if you are, a volunteer in the life of the church and you're a dentist that leads worship, maybe that is that I can't speak to that. But if you are on the staff of a church as a worship pastor and you feel this panic of I'm weary, I'm tired, I need a break. Even just the idea of, there isn't money for us to do that. There isn't. I just think that it's about the courage involved, being courageous enough just to be honest with your pastor, and you know, yeah, finding a safe space for you to begin processing that. I've Yeah, my experience is that healing, and however aware we are or not of our need for it, always takes way longer than I'm hoping.
mm,
You know, and I was in the dentist's the other day. I managed to break a tooth on a granola bar
oh
in this
dear.
really, really posh coffee shop in Dublin,
Oh dear.
where only you have to put a beanie on just to go inside. It's a ultra hipster cool single speed bike cycling kind of a place. I was in the middle of this amazing granola bar that cost me about this size, cost me about €45.
What?
Um, I'm joking. I'm joking. It was a joke about, and it was made of quinoa and pigeon something. I don't know. I'm being silly now, but I went and you know, thought I was, I went to the dentist to get it fixed, and I was getting up because I was done. I was ready to go home. He was like, "You're not finished. Stay where you are."
Oh
I
dear.
was just wishing that the whole thing was over. And
Oh.
I think a lot of the times my relationship with God's timing is very similar. I think I'm ready to go home and ready to crack on, and He's a lot more interested in my heart than I am. I think He's a lot more interested in my heart than at those times when I think back to when I was 30 plus and it was starting to unravel for me. I was afraid of. I'd never been to counseling. I'd never even really kind of been encouraged to think about my inner world and my strengths and weaknesses. I was just, or the Enneagram, or any of those great tools and guides. I just thought if I had enough quiet times that I would quiet time my way out of this. But sometimes we need the help of others. We need support. We need to be. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to be able to just say to somebody, you know, I suppose that's what the confession is all about, isn't it? It's like, I need help. I'm not okay, and being held by people as opposed to the person who's always doing the holding. Um, even there, I think, in the acknowledgement, and in the vulnerability of weakness, something is born. I think in worship, where you aren't this. I can't be a perfect example, but I can be a living example of what following Jesus in the power of the Spirit looks like. Um, yeah, and there's something, I think, really powerful about kind of leading worship. I mean, I can remember people telling us at conferences that you could only ever lead people where you'd been yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I think I've come to think that's just an incredibly damaging idea. It certainly jars with the mutuality thing, and that always kind of holding up. You know, I mean, thank God that because that would say that the extravagance of God can only you know come into the life of a gathering to the degree of which the worship leader or worship pastor has experienced it privately. I mean, oh my word, thankfully that's not true for all the people I've led.
Yeah, but
Um,
that's a challenge what you've just said. That's a whole other interview again, Owen. We'll have to pick that one up. I'm intrigued to talk to you more about that
sure.
particular piece. That is really, really interesting. Um, but I take it you've had a spiritual director. You've found people to journey with you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In different ways and different times. And I think a lot of the language that I have that I would use for my inner life, and that's a lot. Even that is vocabulary I've dug out with other people. They've helped me to realize my propensity to work at things, just to put my head down and just to crack on and not to ask those core questions, those important questions, or even to value myself enough to ask if I'm okay. A lot of those things, they're super subtle, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you need a companion to kind of help you pick them out and tease them apart and kind of go, why do you think that you have issues with control? Why do you think you have issues with power or being seen as vulnerable or weak? Why do you do that? And then there's times when too, and I suppose maybe this is where I went off on a rabbit trail there maybe, but I think there has to be times where people are able to take breaks from ministry, and that's a tough one, where actually being in full-time ministry or part-time ministry, it's not like working at Accenture or working for your local council, or you do your job, you go home, and then you've got the rest of your life. Something about, I mean, I was listening to a John Mark Comer podcast the other day, and he said, that leadership is a form of suffering. That there is something about leadership that is carried, that is not, it's not just about what you do and what you're responsible for, but it is something that you carry. And I think there's times where everyone needs to be able to engage with some self-reflection, whether that's with going to a therapist, or finding a spiritual director. I would even encourage anyone who's interested in exploring that to find somebody outside of your faith tradition, um, somebody who's going to make you, read Henri Nouwen books, and other different things. If we're working that through with a group of leaders at the moment. This incredible book, In the Name of Jesus, by Henri Nouwen. That's probably one of the best books on Christian leadership, or any kind of leadership I've ever. It's just all based on Jesus' temptations in the wilderness. Just amazing. Never get tired of it.
Yeah, really good. I 150% agree with what you're saying. I have a spiritual director who's not from our
Brilliant.
Vineyard tradition, and
Yeah.
sometimes she doesn't know what I'm talking about with my
Yes.
vineyard lingo, and sometimes I don't know what she's trying to get me to do. What is imaginative prayer? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
So I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. And for anyone who is listening to this or watching this, if you need help, please reach out for help. And you can start with your local church. You can also get in touch with us at Vineyard Worship. We know spiritual directors and coaches, and we can point you in some directions if you need help. But that is a really good word, Owen, and I really appreciate you bringing it to us. And
Yeah, of course.
I think it'll reach the right people that need maybe I was gonna say a kick up the butt, but it was more gentle. You were more gentle than that. It was a gentle nudge towards not journeying this leadership suffering on our own.
Yeah.
Um, so I would also love to know, what is it that you are learning as a community, and how do you think that is going to cause you to change shape potentially coming up out of this pandemic? What, what are your current reflections on that? I'm fully understanding that we're all learning to change and adapt, and that horrible word pivot all the time. So what you say
Yeah.
today won't be held against you if you change your mind. But what are you thinking at the moment?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, I suppose there's a component of the question is very much unknown, isn't there? In that sense of, well, certainly the Irish government here in the south, um, we've just heard from the government that things are going to be this way for certainly till the end of April, and that things will change again at the end of May. Hopefully, when we have herd immunity and everyone's vaccinated. But I think we've gotten to the point now where it really does very much feel like this isn't going to be about getting back. And I think psychologically that's important to try and we're trying to just tease that apart with people. And certainly as I speak into vision in throughout the month of May, that journey, I suppose that is the journey that we're going to be encouraging people to think about this. I think psychologically it's important to get away, to kind of remove that tension of how do we possibly get back, because I don't think we can. I don't think that's healthy to think that way. I think it really is about trying to find what's going to work for the future, and um, even just to be kind of open to. I mean, I was attending a Zoom for leaders a few months back, and the person facilitating, speaking, talked about how he had the opportunity to do some ministry in the city of Christchurch in New Zealand, after the rebuilding had closed, that had followed their earthquake. Some people got their money and they just built what they had. But then there was other people who got their money from their damaged buildings and they just built something completely different. And the question he brought in that day was, what are you going to build next? And I have really found that a very formative thought over the last year, that this is an opportunity of unparalleled change. Uncontested was the language he used. So this is a period in our lives in ministry of such uncontested change, that we may never see or experience it like in the same way in our adult lives again. So as those involved in leadership and giving shape to kind of new and emerging communities, this is an opportunity to really try something different. So I think in terms of what we're thinking, we're not wanting to be as building centric, not wanting to be as Sunday centric. And I suppose then part of it is trying to, going back to the point about the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. I suppose just it really is trying to clarify, not complicate. Actually, this is all about discipleship to Jesus. This is about, like when your parents, you're in the park and you've got a little one in a stroller in front of you, and they look at the kid and look at you and they say they're just the spit of you, or certainly that's what they say in Dublin anyway. They're the spitting image of you. That we're meant to be. We're meant to epitomize Jesus. We're meant to be just like him. And when people see us, they think there's another way to live. There's another way to be human. There's another way to live your life. And I suppose it's trying to break that dream down into tangible, next steps, small steps. And I think it's going to look a lot like being gathered, maybe digitally, and God willing in the flesh, but it's going to be about being scattered too. And I think that doesn't just make sense. I actually think it's biblical. There's a rhythm of going out and coming back that we see when Jesus and the disciples, as they proclaim and demonstrate, and I suppose that's the other paradigm too, isn't it? And that's like Vineyard 101, isn't it? What does it mean? Okay, so this is the way we think about what it means to give expression to the kingdom, but what is, actually how are we going to do that? Doing the stuff. That's another great phrase that the Vineyard gave birth to, and those things are. I think they're more important now than ever. I think in a world that is in a culture. Certainly, I can't speak to the one in Northern Ireland or in the UK, but increasingly, progressive, even within the church. There's emerging shapes and forms of progressive Christianity, radical interpretations of the New Testament that are bringing into question who Jesus is and what he thought about himself. And he didn't really think he was God. He didn't really think he was the way, the truth, and the life. Those are just the words that John put in his mouth 70 years after he died, or whatever. Actually, it's going to be. I think to be a person of faith, and certainly in Dublin, is actually to say quite a countercultural thing now. And a big significant word in all this for us is aftermath. I don't know if you're familiar with that word, to live in the aftermath of clerical abuse and the mother and baby homes, and in the aftermath of a global pandemic, and how are we going to survive this? What's going to be left at the end of all of this? I think back to this kind of anxious kind of pressure that I think a lot of church pastors are talking to me about. The great thing, and this has come through just some research of my own, aftermath is actually an agricultural term from the 14th century, which means second harvest.
Really?
And so it's one planting that results in a harvest, which without another planting brings another harvest. And that's something I think that the Lord's really been using to speak to us about this. It wasn't just the feeding of the 5,000, it was the baskets left over. That's another aftermath. It's another second, it's like a second wave. It's like we're not there yet. We're still waiting. And that's the now and the not yet, isn't it? That sense of, God's not finished with the church. And do we have a lot to learn? Yes. And in some ways, maybe we need to be, certainly in our context, tossed to the edge of society to recalibrate ourselves, because it seems to be when the church is at the center of culture and society and money and influence and so on, it seems to lose its way at times. Or maybe that's a huge thing to say without any context. But I suppose it's. I just think, even if the birth of monasticism, that kind of prophetic protest, going out to the desert, going out to the edges, innovating in art and simple ways of living. It's, you know, so this idea of second harvest, of actually in this moment of perceived weakness, being rejected for being so foolish, for following Jesus and holding on to the scriptures and believing that we can tangibly experience the presence of God as we gather as his people. I mean, I had a meeting there a couple of months ago with a local business leader in where the church building. I mean, he was just ridiculing me for following Jesus. You're great. And he's like, oh, you're a great guy. You could probably do anything. Put your mind to it. You know, the right age. You've got 25 years before retirement. Why don't you do something else? He's like, you're crazy. Why would you do this church thing for? I said, well, it's because of Jesus. I think we can, if that's the thing that's there, yeah, it's up to him then. He's gonna finish what he starts, what he started, and we get to celebrate that in a very special way today and Monday, Thursday, tomorrow, through Saturday into Sunday and Easter Sunday. I mean, it's God finishes what he starts. That's the gospel, isn't it? One of the ways of describing it.
Oh my goodness, there was so much in there. That was incredible. And I have never heard the word aftermath explained like that. I think you've just blown my mind. I'm still trying to process that one. It has been so good talking to you. This has been such a meaningful exchange of conversation, and I appreciate the depth of your reflection and certainly your experience as a worship leader for so many years comes through. And so I really hope that people will take you up on your advice there to get some support and journey with someone. I think you also get the prize for the most Wimber quotes.
On the Vineyard podcast, that's you've got to. Yeah, if you're relying on an Anglican for Wimber quotes, that's bad news, isn't it?
Well, I don't
Do
know.
I get a prize for having the weirdest microphone?
I was about to say that's your next prize, and I was going to say, can you guys guess what this thing is? So next time, Eoghan and I are going to do a technology review together because we're both really techie.
The church does not need that, do
Have
they?
lots to offer. So that's an artifact from what year?
Oh, it's easily 15, 20 years old. I looked at the bottom of it like there was going to be a date there. That's how sad I am.
Yeah, but
Like a best before.
join us next time as we review new technology. I'm not a gearhead. What's the opposite of a gearhead? A gear foot or something. I'm like, I'm just like, I can't.
Sounds good.
Technology, but I think we would be able to help people like us. But actually, I shouldn't lump you into my low level of technology. I'm sure you're far more skilled than I am. But it's been really great talking to you, Eoghan, and I do hope
Thanks for having me.
have you at one of our in-person gatherings, and because in some ways I think you've just whetted our appetite for some of the things that you're chewing on. There's a lot more there to unpack. I would love it if you would pray for our worship leaders, because I've just seen time and time again, somebody will watch this a year from now, but it'll be what the Holy Spirit does in their heart as a result of this conversation. That's what I'm after, and I know that's what you're after as well. It's
absolutely, yeah.
about listening to ourselves talk. It's about actually partnering with what the Holy Spirit is doing in the lives of worship leaders. And so we know that people are going to watch this and be chewing on some of the things that you've said. So would you pray for us as well?
I will. Yeah, I'd love to. I might actually read a prayer. Is that okay?
That would be amazing.
Yeah, so this is a prayer from this book, John O'Donoghue. I don't know if you've heard of this book or not. Yeah. It's great, but it's called For a New Beginning. In out-of-the-way places of the heart, where your thoughts never think to wander, this beginning has been quietly forming. waiting until you were ready to emerge. For a long time, it has watched your desire, feeling the emptiness growing inside you, noticing how you willed yourself on, still unable to leave what you had outgrown. It watched you play with the seduction of safety and the grey promises that sameness whispered, heard the waves of turmoil rise and relent, and wondered, will you always have to live like this? Then the delight when your courage kindled and out you stepped onto new ground, your eyes young again with energy and dream, a path of plenitude opening before you. Though your destination is not yet clear, you can trust the promise of this opening. Unfurl yourself into the grace of beginning that is one with your life's desire. Awaken your spirit to adventure. Hold nothing back. Learn to find ease in risk. Soon you will be home in a new rhythm, for your soul senses the world that awaits you. I just love those words, awaken your spirit to adventure. As you listen now, as we sit together in God's presence, I pray, Lord, that you would awaken us. Give us eyes to see what you're doing, ears to hear what you're saying. Help us, Lord, to not waste our hearts on fear. And we ask these things, Jesus, in your strong and beautiful name and for your kingdom's sake. Amen.
That was a powerful prayer. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Thanks for sharing your own journey and thoughts with us, and I hope we get to connect with you again soon, Eoghan.
Absolutely. Thank you.